I'm not going to speak about the books that were mentioned, nor my enormous influence apparently over the current administration. I want to get a little. Since I spent much of today at 30,000 feet, I was thinking a little bit from that height, and really, my question that I assigned myself was the following. I've spent a lot of time in Europe, married to a German woman, which I want to talk about European lack of self-confidence. There's the sort of ground zero. But how did it come to be that a civilization of so great an achievement, so great an expanse of artistic, architectural, political, civilizational achievement today finds itself so deeply in the depths of a kind of lack of self-confidence, a kind of self-doubt, and even, dare I say, a kind of self-loathing. And in this sense, it really seems to me that the theme of the conference on the soul of Europe seems quite right to me. And I thought I'd spend a little time reflecting on what is the European soul? What is the soul in Europe? And why is that soul seemingly so deeply ill today? The European soul, if we can term it in that way, and it is a distinct form of soul, it's a distinct idea of the soul as distinct from other concepts of the soul that exist in other civilizations, of course, arose as a consequence of Christianity primarily, which holds that all human souls share an equal dignity, created in the image and likeness of God. This is, of course, a constant refrain one will hear, especially on the American conservative right, that emphasizes the inherent dignity of every human life when we speak about such issues as abortion, as issues such as euthanasia, that every human soul has an inherent and inviolable dignity. But there's another side to the European soul, which is that dignity exists. It is given. It is a gift and a conferral of God. And it cannot be destroyed or diminished by any outside source, neither torture, nor slavery, nor debasement, nor even unequal stations in an aristocratic society, for example, lead to the debasement of one soul as compared to another soul. But we can debase our own souls. The consequence of our own choices can lead to the debasement of our own souls. So while we have equal human dignity, nevertheless, we can in some ways compromise that dignity. And one of the great foundational texts of the European tradition, of course, is none other than Dante's Divine Comedy, which treats deeply and profoundly this topic, the degradation of the human soul that Dante encounters with Virgil in the Inferno and ascends ultimately to Paradiso. This understanding of the European soul then gave rise at its heart to the greatness of European civilization. In order to prevent the degradation of the human soul, Europe developed a series of what Philip Rieff, the social theorist, sociologist, social psychologist Philip Rieff, described in his 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, that great civilizations, such as the European civilization, consist in a series of what he called interdicts. Interdicts. Thou shalt nots. All great civilizations require some degree, some formation of interdicts. Thou shalt nots. And these forms of interdicts vary from civilization to civilization, but all civilizations share them. Philip Rieff also argued that all civilizations, if they're going to function, have to allow for occasional organized remission of the interdicts, right? Occasional loosening of the interdicts with permission, with a kind of sanction. If you've ever experienced Mardi Gras or Carnival, those kinds of events, you will have experienced remission from interdicts. Of course, when every day is Mardi Gras in Bourbon Street, you are living in a world of complete remission. And in fact, that turns me to the recognition that the interdicts that existed for much of Christian European history were the interdicts that addressed the great 7 deadly sins identified from the earliest years of Christianity: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. And yet, if we think about those interdicts, or the interdicts that existed in relationship to those 7 deadly sins, what we have to recognize is that today we have undergone a kind of radical revolution. The modern world has redefined most, if not all, of those sins today as virtues. As virtues, as desirable qualities, those aspects, activities that we ought to pursue. Well, we'll begin with the first one and most obvious one: lust. You can't walk down a street today without having your propensity to lust stimulated. Advertising, television, whatever's on the internet, just every corner that we face, every aspect of life is suffused with the release of lust. And this is closely, of course, related in advertising to the promotion of gluttony. Consumerism is, you could say, the way in which gluttony manifests itself today. Lust is indeed tightly bound to the way in which we promote gluttony in our world today. Greed, the third of the great deadly sins, is one in which we live daily. Money becomes, and the accumulation of ever more money becomes, the highest, and in some ways, in some places, the most exclusive form of value. Perhaps the most difficult and challenging of the great 7 deadly sins that we face today, and I think is perhaps deeply and profoundly situated in Europe today, is acedia, sloth. This sometimes means laziness, but it has a deeper and wider meaning: resignation, lassitude. One definition describes it as a habitual disinclination to exertion, not exerting yourself. Affectlessness, boredom, apathy, indifference, a kind of a life-led doom scrolling. And I see you out there doom scrolling with your phones. One other definition of acedia or sloth is the lack of feeling toward the world and the people in it. This is one of the great sins of our age, but one we are deeply enmeshed in. The fifth of the great 7 deadly sins, wrath. Well, we've just gone through a period of time in which the entire Western world, including, of course, Europe, has been organized around the great sin of wrath. How else would one describe wokeness and DEI? But the manifestation, the organized manifestation of wrath. We will seek vengeance on those that we deem to have done wrong against us on the basis of various ascriptions: race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. The sixth, indeed one of the most pervasive and deadly of the 7 deadly sins, envy. The envy that's experienced toward the achievements of others. That envy that perhaps lies at the heart of a system designed around complete and total social welfare comfort. You will not ever have to confront genuine crisis, genuine difficulties in your life, because envy ensures that no one at any point will experience the kind of inequality that a capitalist system tends to generate. And the 7th of the deadly sins, pride, what the great thinkers in the Catholic tradition described as the root of all of these other sins, C.S. Lewis described as anti-God. Anti-God. Pride is the belief that we humans can do it all ourselves. Pride is the belief in human dominion and control and power. And in some ways, you could say that, for example, the crisis today that's described in climate change, the various crises that we experience today, are certain expressions of pride. The belief that we human beings cause this and we can control it. We actually have the ability to control the consequences of our own pride. So we've undergone a revolution in which what was once regarded as the 7 deadly sins around which a civilization would organize itself to seek to tutor us, to avoid enmeshing ourselves in these 7 deadly sins, to a civilization in which we have come to celebrate them, embrace them, and organize our world around them. So in the first place, we could say a revolution occurred in Europe, going back hundreds of years, which sought to displace these old 7 deadly sins, to release, to allow for remission, complete remission, ongoing and total remission of all of these 7 deadly sins, with the belief of those who originated this revolution that we would be free. This is the origins of the liberal project. We would be free from all of the efforts to control our lusts, our gluttony, our greed, our envy, and so forth. We would be free from all of the institutions, marriage, family, that, of course, is the central way in which lust, right, seeks to be reduced, channeled, controlled, minimized, that we be released from such things as family. And the belief was that, therefore, we could live in an interdictless world, a world without interdicts, a genuinely free world. But as it turns out, and again, as I was reflecting on what are the sources of the crisis of self-confidence in Europe, it turns out Philip Rieff was right. There is no civilization that exists without interdicts. And the overturning of the old interdicts simply led to the rise of a new set of interdicts. And on the flight over here from 30,000 feet, I tried to identify what are the 7 deadly sins according to modern liberalism. What are the replacements? What are the new interdicts? We might draw up somewhat different lists, but I think you'll recognize and probably agree with some of the ones that I came up with. The first one, nationalism. These are all going to be isms. Nationalism is the first of the great interdicts. Thou shalt not be a nationalist. This, of course, extends to a rejection, not just of nationalism in its virulent form, but the rejection even of a love and care for one's own place as parochial, as unjustified, as too limiting. The natural preference we have to assist those who are close to us, those who are our neighbors, our friends, our fellow citizens, is regarded as a form of preference that's no longer acceptable. This was, of course, the great outcry against Vice President Vance when he invoked the Ordo Amoris, right? The old teaching of the church that one should care, one does naturally care to those who are closest to oneself, and moves outward in circles of care that extends outward, but in everyday life will manifest itself most closely with those in proximity. The second deadly sin of modern liberalism, colonialism. And again, these sins of liberalism, according to liberalism, in many cases are in fact based in rightful recognition of injustices. But what's really noteworthy is the way that these various sins, according to liberalism, became radicalized. So abuses of belief in the nation now turn inward to a rejection of the idea we should care and treasure that which is closest to us. Colonialism begins with the rightful condemnation of oppression and injustice, but comes to be belief in the moral inferiority of former colonialists, i.e. Europeans, and the moral superiority of those who were formerly colonized. Just like with nationalism, it morphs into a pervasive form of civilizational guilt and self-accusation. The third ism, racism, of course, which again is a real injustice and rightfully needs to be called out. but in seeking its redress has led, of course, in recent years to the rise of wokeness and DEI and identity politics. That is to say, a further extension of the belief in the collective guilt of anyone who could be deemed in any way to be involved in the form of systematic racism. Whether you personally were or not, you are enmeshed in a system in which your individual actions matter less than something that is regarded as systemic, and therefore the adoption and embrace of a form of collective guilt in which forgiveness is not possible. The fourth of these sins, according to modern liberalism, sexism, again, rightly condemns unjust treatment toward women, toward homosexuals, toward those who have been unjustly suppressed and repressed in over many ages. But of course, we have seen this form of this idea of a sin in this case extend without limit, and to seek ultimately the erasure of all sexual difference, ultimately to render the difference between man and woman unexceptional, accidental, correctable, perhaps even, that marriage and children, therefore, is a matter of social and political indifference, and extends even to the idea that human sexuality itself is malleable, our gender is malleable and alterable simply by consensus or by technology. 5, another ism. I was going to say Christianity, but there wasn't an ism, so I'll say Catholicism is the first of the religions, the European religions, to come under the direct gaze and accusation of modern liberalism, the religion that is in some ways the most opposite to liberal assumptions. But more broadly, Christianity becomes categorized in the same way as nationalism and colonialism and racism. That is to say, viewed as being an oppressor, an historic form of oppression, minimizing, if not altogether rejecting the idea of its contributions to the civilization, and simply calling for its demotion and even delegitimation in both public and even private forms, while at the same time, of course, that which is non-Christianity escapes any notice and scrutiny, in particular, of course, today, Islam. The sixth of the sins, modern sins, according to liberalism's thou shalt not, is conservatism. This is one of the great sins, to be a conservative. This is why one won't find any conservatives in the official institutions of modern liberal society, universities, media, NGOs, and so forth. The past becomes suspect. Tradition becomes suspect. The past must be superseded. Progress becomes the quasi-official stance toward time. So conservatism becomes that which is unacceptable. And number 7, in looking for a kind of analog for pride, the mother source of all of the 7 deadly sins of Christianity, I thought maybe nothing served better than the idea of judgmentalism. Because everything I've just described, right, from racism, sexism, Catholicism, conservatism, nationalism, all of these in some ways are viewed as being species of being judgmental. Judgment as in drawing distinctions. Some of these distinctions are unjust, but some, of course, are based in our nature, such as being a man and a woman. The only 2 creatures that I know of in human existence that can produce a child. Right? To simply note that there is a difference is regarded now as judgmental, as being in some ways ascribing a meaning to something, to simple fact, that was once, of course, highly recognized, but is now seen as a kind of judgmentalism. In other words, all of these modern sins have a basis in something real, racism, colonialism, nationalism, but have been radicalized to the point in which they have contributed as a whole to the conclusion in which the foundations of Europe itself were ill-founded. To the extent that Europe is has a tradition and history in nationalism or nations, participated in colonialism, has had a history of differentiating men and women, has had a history in Catholicism. We could go down the list. Europe itself stands under condemnation. And the only way then to expiate ourselves of these sins is to loathe ourselves, is to loathe our Europeanness. And this self-loathing becomes now the definition of what it is to be a good European. Here I am standing in Brussels, in which this is the official theological position of this secular city. Only by expiating these sins can one be a member in good standing in modern Europe. Of course, this leads then to a rejection of one's own actual, deep, profound European tradition. That which made Europe great. That which made Europe the envy of the world. That which makes, for Americans, us still want to come here every summer and walk around and look at your great buildings and eat your great food. Right? Which is kind of a remnant of what was a great civilization, a self-confident civilization. Thus, what is disposed is a respect and regard for one's own places, for one's own traditions, for one's own people, the centrality of family and culture, the depth of the religious origins of Europe, and the depth of the continuity of those origins, even in the way in which we still regard every human soul as having inherent dignity. Still there, a little bit. It's becoming weaker, but it's still there. The idea that somehow Europe was a place of nations while also simultaneously something universal, a federation of particular places, but sharing a common inheritance drawn from Christendom. Not merely an idea or a theory, but a place with a history and with memory, requiring stewardship and care and cultivation, the passing on of what we are from one generation to the next. This is what conservatism is, one of those sins, the passing on of this tradition from one generation to the next. I don't know if there's a civilization that's ever faced quite what Europe faces today, if I'm right about this. A kind of institutionalized, organized, political, social, educational, almost pervasive sense of self-loathing, a regard for what we are, what we have been, and what we could yet still be as fundamentally the new 7 deadly sins. Now, it's necessary and right that we recognize where those are actually sins, but that we reject their radicalization and the effort to turn them into forms of self-loathing. So while today's Europe, it seems to me, is pervasively in the midst of this kind of organized self-loathing, yet paradoxically, what's needed today is a form of one of the old deadly sins. There needs to be a kind of pride. There needs to be a kind of self-confidence in what Europe is, what it was, and what it shall be. Not simply taking its cues from disliking Trump, disliking America, finding its self-confidence in being not Trump and not America, but what it is, where its greatness lies. And thus I think Europe today is facing a radical and abrupt crossroad. It seems to me there are really 2 possibilities. One of them is to continue down the path of further radicalizing these 7 modern deadly sins, which will lead to the complete self-immolation of any idea that there is a Europe worthy of recovering. The other is not to go back, but it is to bring forward in new ways and in new forms. a civilization that shifts the interdicts away from ones that achieve only self-loathing and creates or recreates interdicts that recognize that in those 7 deadly sins that Christianity identified, that there are corresponding excellences that adhere to all of those 7 deadly sins. In taming those sins, there are excellences. In taming lust comes fidelity and honor and respect, especially between the sexes. In taming gluttony, there comes to be moderation, especially moderation in material things. Moderation also simply in the love of money and an appreciation rather for the things that really matter. Relationships, honoring the memory, honoring the generations that precede and follow us. In taming greed, we develop the capacity for charity, for liberality, the better form of liberalism, liberality. Perhaps one of the great challenges facing Europe today is to develop that great positive alternative to sloth, effort, care, the opposite of indifference, commitment, work, building. It took 800 years to build the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The people who began that building knew they would not live to see it. Are we capable of that? That's the opposite of sloth. That is commitment. 5, the opposite of wrath. And having gone through this period of DEI, wokeness, identity politics, what's needed is the capacity to forgive, and including forgive ourselves, forgive our own civilization. Understanding that all civilizations do wrong, but this does not mean that we have to conclude that we must end in self-loathing. 6, envy. Taming envy leads to the capacity for satisfaction, not only in our own achievements, but admiration and respect for the achievements of others. Not envying, but respecting and even celebrating. I always think of that first great sin, well, I guess the second great sin in the book of Genesis, the murder of Abel by Cain. And why is this? Because God, for some unknown reason, gave favor to Abel's sacrifice. And the person closest to him in the world, his brother, killed him. That's envy. Wouldn't a brother take joy when God honors a brother? Ought we not to take joy when others achieve great things? And lastly, while the opposite or the corrective of pride is humility, all of these together and their taming, the civilization required to tame them, everything from fidelity and family and moderation and charity, commitment, forgiveness, the satisfaction of one's achievements, leads to maybe not pride, but a kind of self-confidence. A self-confidence that we have achieved something in shaping a civilization around these interdicts. So you're going to hear a lot today about immigration, probably already have heard a lot today and tomorrow about immigration and the green madness of the green policies and the madness of the European Commission. But our deepest problem, it seems to me, at some level is ultimately theological. It's a theological problem. It's what we believe about ourselves, what we believe is required of us, what we believe are the great sins that we face, the great temptations that we face. And it seems to me that if we can correct what have become a very bad set of interdicts, or a radicalized set of interdicts, and to revisit and reinvent anew those interdicts that gave rise to the greatness of a European civilization whose evidence still surrounds us, then we can make Europe great again.